guys, in today's video we're going to be looking at the scientific method, the method scientists use in order to conduct experiments. So in this video we're going to be identifying the purpose of the scientific method. We're going to be able to define the steps of the scientific method, and we'll be able to have the ability to relate the scientific method to an actual experiment. So the scientific method is a set of steps that scientists use in order to conduct experiments and get results. So it starts with asking a question. So first step, ask a question. So what thing do you want to know? There's usually some basis for this question, so you've already done some sort of research, and you're like, oh, I wonder about this. Then, after you've done that, you're going to do some background research. So what has already been done on this topic? What still needs to be done? What can you do to improve your question? From this background information, you can construct a hypothesis. This hypothesis is a guess of what you believe is going to happen. After you've done that, you're going to test your hypothesis through experimentation. So you'll perform a bunch of different experiments where you change variables and see what happens, and then analyze what data you've gotten and draw conclusions about your data. And then lastly, you want to communicate your results. You want to let other people know what you found. Okay, and here we have just a fancy little flow chart. So first you ask a question, then you do your research, your background research, you construct that hypothesis, then you test. Is the procedure working? Yes. Then you'll go on, you'll analyze that data and draw conclusions. Does it align? If it does, you communicate results. Does it not? If it doesn't, you still communicate results, but you can then go back and do more experimental data, form a new hypothesis, and try all over again. And then, of course, if your procedure is not working, you could troubleshoot and go back and try a different experiment. So let's first start out with our hypothesis. So when we have our question, we have to have some idea of what the answer to the question is. So this is the answer to the question. I'm going to just do these little, those things right there. Because we don't know if it's the right question. We don't know if it's the right answer. Who knows? So we're going to use this hypothesis, this best guess, to try and figure out what's going on. A whole, if I do this, if this, then this will happen. Okay? Now, this is an educated guess. Meaning that you've already done the research to back up this hypothesis. And another note, your hypothesis, you have to have predictions that are measurable. With your hypothesis, you are expecting results. And your hypothesis should predict those results. So your hypothesis will predict your results. And those predictions have to be measurable. For instance, we could look at a hypothesis about plants, like tomato plants. So if we have a tomato plant, our question can be, does the amount of sun matter on how well the plant grows? And Our hypothesis could be if you increase your sunlight, then you will have a plant that grows taller, a tomato plant that grows taller. Something in there that would be considered measurable would be the amount of sunlight or the amount of sunlight that increases the height of your plant. So you can look at changing the amount of sunlight and see how the height of the plant changes. What is not measurable is something like the tomato plant likes the sun. That is not a measurable quantity, but we can measure height. So height could be a measurable thing. So the increase in sunlight increases the height of the plant would be your measurable prediction, while tomato plants just liking the sun is not. Next is our experimentation. So what we're going to do to test our hypothesis. So is our prediction accurate? We will use our experimentation in order to support or not support this. So whenever you're doing an experiment, you need to make sure you do it in such a way that you only change one thing at a time. So we change only one experimental condition at a time. We don't want to confuse the results by changing a bunch of things at one time. And repeat, 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 rinse and repeat. Repeat repeatedly. Repeat experiment many times. You don't want to just have an accidental result. Oh, I got this. Oh, I'm not going to test again. Not okay. You have to experiment many times. We have what are called experimental controls. So basically a control group that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to have an experimental group. So experimental group, that's the group where we're changing things. So the one factor changed group. And then our control group, this is the group where we're not going to change anything. So all the factors in the group remain unchanged. Okay. Now, we do this through experiment variables or experimental variables. Things that are changing in experiment are variables. We have experimental variables. Here are the things that are changing during the experiment. And we have two types. We have our independent variable. Our independent variable is going to be the thing that the scientist is changing. And then what we're going to be observing is our dependent variable. The variable that depends on what changes in our independent variable. So we're going to focus on this dependent variable to see how it changes in response to the independent variable. So this changes in response to the independent variable. Okay. And then we have our control variable. What's not changing? So constant variable. For instance, if we think back to our tomato plant, we could say that our independent variable would be sun exposure time on a tomato plant. Our dependent variable could be the tomato plant height, and then our control variable could be something like the amount of water all tomato plants receive. All the tomato plants are going to receive the same amount of water, whether they are getting more or less sun, so that could be a controlled variable that's the same throughout. Okay, after we've done our experimentation carefully and with our variables in place, changing and observing, we're going to analyze and draw conclusions. So what does your experiment tell you? What data you get? What is it going to, what picture has it drawn for you? And then after you've collected and analyzed all of your measurements, does it support your hypothesis or not? So collect and analyze data. Ask, does the data support the hypothesis? And oftentimes it won't. And you'll have to start back over, and that's fine. It's fine if the predictions were not accurate. Experimentation is something that is constantly being done over and over again. You just take the conclusions that you draw and do additional experiments and see if you can come up with a good hypothesis that you can actually validate. But no matter what, you want to communicate your results. So you want to let the wider scientific community know about your results. There's a bunch of different ways. A professional scientist is going to communicate their results through publishing their findings. So a professional scientist will combine and communicate. So communicate results through a published paper or some sort of talk. So they'll go and give a presentation or they'll give a poster at some sort of scientific meeting, and they'll give all of their results. A lot of times they'll show what didn't work, what did work, so that other scientists can understand and either use their data to continue on or know, okay, I shouldn't go that way. If we're talking about a more novice scientist, so someone who is young, like elementary school or middle school, they might do a science fair project or a lab report. So they will do the same thing. They'll use the scientific method in order to get data. And once they get that data, they can communicate it to other novice scientists or older people. And then we have our budding scientists. And these can be somewhere in between. They could do lab reports, or they can go through and do poster presentations or talks, or even sometimes end up on published papers. So these are still going to be people who are communicating their results. Okay, well, that is everything I have for you guys on the scientific method. I hope you were able to understand our learning objectives for this topic. I will talk to you guys in the next video. Bye.